Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. We're going to be covering Federalist number 39 today, The Conformity of the Plan to Republican Principles, written by James Madison, January 18, 1788. Topics conclude the characteristics of Republican government, the organization of the proposed government, sovereignty of states, and federal versus national acts, as well as the Electoral College. So this is one of the most profound papers in laying out what the federal government is supposed to be and how it is differentiating from it being a national government and a kind of a intermixture of the federal and the national character, but mostly to me it more forms its power from a federal nature, and I'll explain why. And federal meaning that it acquires its power from the states and the representatives and the people, rather than a national government that is just kind of a top down, where the national government holds all of the power itself and it's directly elected by the people, but it's not representative of the individual states or the individual provinces or territories. So it gives, like, for example, just to try to clarify here, the federal government has they have their own national powers, as in they act in a national head when it comes to national defense in the military. That's kind of more of the national character. But the way in which they draw their power in the federal government is that of the federal power, because the senators and the House of Rep members are elected by the people themselves to represent. And it used to actually be the senators would be elected from the state legislature, which is actually even more of a federal structure than that of a national structure. And I'll go on to explain this more, and it'll become more clear as I go on here. So in this paper, Madison is tasked with defining the government proposed as Republican, a Republican form of government rather than a democracy or a monarchy or a aristocracy and oligarchy. So he states first, and I quote, "The first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly Republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom. To rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. If the plan of the convention, therefore, be found to depart from the Republican character, its advocates must abandon it as no longer defensible," end quote. And this is something that should be taken, and this very last sentence here, this should be taken actually in real life. This should be taken in modern life. If the plan of the convention, or to put it in modern terms, if the plan of our government currently is found to depart from the Republican character, we must abandon it. It is no longer defensible. The idea of having a socialist or a monarchy or just any form of government that is different, that does not give everyone the same inalienable rights or the same civil liberties as everyone else, then we should abandon it in its entirety. Thus, there shouldn't be like these giant redistributions of wealth, where the government is taking money from one and giving it to the other, because then that's not a Republican form, that's not a free country. He asks like a rhetorical question, what then are the distinctive characters of the Republican form? So this is kind of what he's tasked with in this paper, and then he lays out three distinct characteristics, I think, to answer some of his objectors. And in this one, he hits the first one, and then the other two, I think he hits in the next couple of papers. So Madison names multiple examples that prove that a Republican form of government has been misconstrued in many cases where the people did not hold the power. And he's going to explain all these different countries, countries, or other they called them republics, but in character and in practice they actually were not republics. So he states, and I quote, "Holland, in which no particle of the supreme authority is derived from the people, has passed almost universally under the denomination of a republic. The same title has been bestowed on Venice, where absolute power over the great body of the people is exercised in the most absolute manner by a small body of hereditary nobles. Poland, which is a mixture of aristocracy and of monarchy in their worst forms, has been dignified with the same appellation. The government of England, which has one republican branch only, combined with a hereditary aristocracy and monarchy, has with equal impropriety been frequently placed on the list of republics, end quote. So really the main form, the one of the most foundational and the most fundamental characters or fundamental elements of a republic is that the power is supposed to be derived from the people, and it seems like in all of these before listed, that's not the case. So he goes on next. He states, and I quote, "If we resort for a criterion to the different principles on which different forms of government are established, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its power directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior," end quote. So this is the fundamental core element of what a republic is supposed to be, that it's self-government, and the government is supposed to be reliant on its constituency to continue its administration as long as it's under its own good behavior. Really, ultimately, the people decide the form of government, or the people to be in the government, not the form of government. But well, in this case, they did actually determine the form of government. But I highly suggest anyone that's listening actually go back into, and this is the first time I've said this, actually read Federalist number 39, because it's very uplifting, and it's enlightening to read. If you can get anybody in a general sense just to read it and understand what the government is actually supposed to be composed of comparatively to what it really is now. So next what he does is he asserts, and I quote, "It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it," end quote. So there should not be a favored class of citizens that are in the government. The government essentially should be derived from the great body of people, not a few very rich dudes or a few connected individuals. The vote should really be derived from the people themselves. So he continues on this. He states, and I quote, "It is sufficient for such government that the persons administering it be appointed either directly or indirectly by the people, and that they hold their appointments by either of the tenures just specified. Otherwise, every government in the United States, as well as every other popular government that has been or can be well organized or well executed, would be degraded from the republican character," end quote. So the most important part is he's saying indirectly, let's say, so Supreme Court justices technically are much more indirectly than a House of Representative. A representative from the House is actually derived directly from the people by a Democratic vote, whereas a Supreme Court justice does come from a vote that is indirect from the people. It comes from a president nomination and then an appointing and confirmation from the Senate. So that's more of an indirect nature. But the most important thing of this is that they hold their appointments by either the tenure just specified, as in the people themselves, and their good or otherwise or good behavior. And that's really how the Supreme Court justices work. They are on good behavior, so they can actually be impeached as well. Let's see. So the next he goes on. He explains and compares many state governments and their issues, such as the executive magistrate being appointed and not elected. He goes on to explain that a little bit. And then the next one, he starts to lay out the way in which our federal government's going to work with the House of Reps, how long their term is, how long the senator's term is, how long the president's term is, how people are elected. He goes on to individual states, like, oh, this is from South Carolina. We took this part from South Carolina. We took this part from New Jersey. We took this part from, Massachusetts, but we altered it a little bit. We added an extra year to the terms of the House of Representatives. So what they did was, the Constitutional Convention, they really got around and they actually looked at all the different programs and all different avenues that they could have taken, and they took the best one that I guess the representatives thought was the most conducive to the people. So Madison next, he lays out the organization of the Republican standard set by the proposed Constitution, drawing concepts from some state constitutions. Like I said, the House of Representatives will be periodically elected for the period of 2 years. The Senate is to be elected as well for a period of 6 years, but the Senate was to be elected by the state legislatures rather than the people directly, which is much more indirect, but it is representative of the sovereignty of states and state legislatures. The president is to hold a term elected every 4 years. So, and then next what he goes on, this is very important to currently today in modern times, in Federalist number 39, he states, and I quote, "The President of the United States is impeachable at any time during his continuance in office. The tenure by which the judges are to hold their places is as it unquestionably ought to be, that of good behavior," end quote. So, meaning that there can be an impeachment of the judges. I've said that before. And they're supposed to stay there. It's pretty much a lifetime term, unless if they really screw up and actually do something legitimately criminal, or they get impeached. And I would beg to differ that taking away Second Amendment rights from people as a judge is something that's not in good behavior, and I would question that as illegal myself, because now you are circumventing the Constitution, which many of our judges, our Supreme Court judges, we got about 4 of them that are circumventing the Constitution consistently, straight black and white writing that should be impeached. But the most important part about this here is the President of the United States is only impeachable during his continuance in office. You cannot impeach the guy after he is gone, because they are no longer the President of the United States. Now you can try to charge them with some sort of criminal charges or a crime or something of that nature, but you cannot impeach a guy that is no longer in office, which is relative to today, because that's what they're trying to do. It's a completely unconstitutional move, and it is what it is, I guess. I don't know. The liberals don't really care if anything is constitutional or not anymore. People that go out on you go on your Facebook feed or you go on your Twitter and you say whatever you want, and you think you're so edgy and you're so much smarter and much more elitist and more intelligent than the conservative class and the Trump supporters that you call and you deem as racist all the time, but you really actually don't even know the laws and you don't know the rules of the Constitution and the way in which our government is to run. So I don't really know how much more intelligent and elitist you are than us deplorables, Walmart people. So Madison, he adds that the prohibition of titles of nobility found in the Constitution is another guarantee of Republican government. So yeah, there was to be no titles of nobility in the United States. Now, may there not be titles of nobility, but we'll see in this next coming week, because right now I'm recording this early. We'll actually see if there are subliminal titles of nobility as it relates to the stock market situation in GameStop right now. We'll see on Monday, because I'm recording this over the weekend. We will see on Monday if the government is going to go for a shutdown of the stock market to avoid hedge funders from losing their money and being defunded, or if we're going to see it from the big companies, big corporations that aren't going to allow you to buy GameStop or Nokia or BlackBerry or AMC. We'll see what ends up happening if we actually really do have some sort of a subliminal title of nobility in the United States of America, which it seems like right now we do. So next, the author answers objections that this new form of government will form, and I quote, "a national government which regards the Union as a consolidation of the states," end quote. So that is what the objectors to the Constitution are saying. They are opposed to the proposed Constitution because they're saying it's a national government. It doesn't set up a federal government. And he goes on, and this is him characterizing what his dissenters are saying. He says, and this is what the dissenters say, "But it was not sufficient, say the adversaries of the proposed Constitution, for the convention to adhere to the Republican form. They ought with equal care to have preserved the federal form, which regards the Union as a confederacy of sovereign states, instead of which they have framed a national government which regards the Union as a consolidation of states," end quote. So that's him characterizing what his objectors are saying. So the argument that is being made is that under the proposed Constitution, the people and states will lose their sovereignty to one national government. Madison combats this argument by stating, and I quote, "Without inquiring into the accuracy of the distinction on which the objection is founded, it will be necessary to a just estimate of its force, first to ascertain the real character of the government in question, secondly, to inquire how far the convention were authorized to propose such a government, and thirdly, how far the duty they owed to their country could supply an effect of regular authority." So, in this one, he's going to be dealing with the very first charge here, that to answer the objections, he needs to answer these other charges. It will be necessary to the just estimate of its force first, to ascertain the real character of the government in question. So that's what this paper is all about, ascertaining the real government, the character of the government in question. And then he goes on to explain, and then he'll hit the other ones. This will be in later papers. I'll go over those. So he states, and I quote, "The Constitution is to be founded on the assent and ratification of the people of America." He continues, "This assent and ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. The act, therefore, establishing the Constitution will not be a national but a federal act," end quote. So, this is very important. The Constitution had to be ratified by the people, or it had to be ratified by the state. The state had to ratify the Constitution. They had to accept it. It wasn't something that, if you looked at the 13 colonies, right? This is the best way to explain it. 9 out of the 13 at the time had to sign in. And then that would cause the United States of America. But those other 4, let's say 9 of them signed up, the other 4 didn't. Those 4 were not the United States of America. Thus, that making it in and of itself, the federal government is recognizing the sovereignty of those 4 states that are not signing into the Constitution. So those 9 states are the United States of America, but those other 4 aren't forced into the United States of America. They're not forced into the country. And this is also a freedom principle, the idea of secession as well. It kind of relates to this. Those 4 states have their own independent sovereignty, and that's recognized by this Constitution. Now, if they want to sign up to come over to the United States of America, then that's fine. They're in the United States of America. But that, in essence, makes it a federal act, because you need a unanimous, almost not a unanimous decision to become the United States of America, but that state has to buy in. There's no, oh, you guys are forced in because the other 9 states like the idea of becoming the United States of America. So that in and of itself is of the federal, it's much more of a federal act than a national act, because otherwise a national act would just have, oh, the majority of the states like it, okay, you guys are all the United States of America. This recognized the sovereignty of individual statehood. So Madison claims that the Constitution must be observed in its entirety only from the result of a unanimous agreement with all the states that fall under, that's the most important part, a unanimous agreement with all the states that fall under its jurisdiction. So all the states, if you all buy into it, yeah, you have to unanimously buy into it to be in the United States. So the next he goes on, and I quote, "That it will be a federal and not a national act, as these terms are understood by the objectors, the act of the people as forming so many independent states, not as forming one aggregate nation, is obvious from the single consideration that it is to result neither from the decision of a majority of the people of the Union, nor from that of a majority of the states. It must result from the unanimous assent of the several states that are parties to it, differing no otherwise from their ordinary assent than it being expressed not by the legislative authority but by that of the people themselves," end quote. It's exactly what I was explaining. It has to be unanimous, the states that are all a party to the United States of America. It's not a majority. So that in essence makes it a federal act. So he explains next, and I quote, "Each state is in ratifying the Constitution is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. In this relation, then, the new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national Constitution." That's the most important part, and it's just him repeating what he's saying before and trying to clarify it. Next, Madison explains the powers from which the branches derive themselves. Another important thing. He states, and I quote, "The House of Representatives will derive its power from the people of America." Now this is something that is considered of the national character, because it is much more of a democratic vote. And it's from the people themselves, the numbers, the amount of population. Whereas the state, on the other hand, and it's more the House of Representatives is more representative of the people themselves, of the population of the citizenry. Whereas the Senate, on the other hand, was to be derived from the powers of the states, because the state legislature selected at this time the senators, which that is much more of the federal character. So the Senate recognizes state legislative power, whereas the House of Representatives recognizes the state's population, the people themselves. Now, it's not like this anymore. Now, everything is like the House of Representatives. I'm a huge fan of the way it was before. Now, Madison, he describes the House of Representatives and Senate as political and co-equal societies. These two will compose the two chambers of Congress. So Madison explains the use of the Electoral College as well. He states, and I quote, "The votes allotted to them are in a compound ratio, as a method for which the president shall be elected, which is both of the federal and national character." And the reason that it's of the federal and national character is because they're compounding the two. They're compounding the senators. If anybody doesn't know, the way that the Electoral College works is the number of electoral votes you get in your state is a combination of how many senators you have and how many House of Representatives you have. So if you have, in this state, let's say we have 15 in New Jersey. I think we have 15. We have 15 Electoral College votes, so that means we have 2 senators and we have 13 House of Rep members. So it's supposed to be of both characters, the federal and the national, because it has one from the Senate and one from the House of Reps. That's why I'm a huge fan and proponent of the senators being elected by the state's representatives, or the state legislatures. That being said, Madison has set many terms for why this proposed constitution extols a federal rather than a national government. And there's certain things that are national, but it seems like it's more leaning towards a federal structure. And the most important part is because even the federal government themselves, if you look at the House of Reps and the Senate, if you really think about it, the House of Reps are directly elected by the people, and then you think of the Senate is directly reliant on the people. And at the end of the day, the fact that they are so reliant on the people, it kind of does make it more of a federal structure than it does a national government structure. Now, Madison next confronts the operation of the government under the proposed constitution shall be under both the national character as well as the federal character, and controversies that involve foreign powers, it is to be considered national in operations or controversies that are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. These operations are that of the national character. And I'm going to try to explain this over this next quote. So next he states, and I quote, "The difference between a federal and national government as it relates to the operation of the government is supposed to consist in this, that in the former the powers operate the political bodies composing the Confederacy in their political capacities, in the latter on the individual citizens composing the nation in their individual capacities. On trying the Constitution by this criterion, it falls under the national, not the federal character, though perhaps not so completely as has been understood." So he's saying because the operation of the government, a lot of it is composed from the people themselves, that it kind of makes it of the national character in terms of the operation of the government, the way in which it runs, the federal government, but it actually is not what it seems. He's going to go on to explain it. He asserts that all other existences that do not fall under the direct jurisdiction of the federal government will be handled on a state-to-state basis, and that's the difference. Is okay, the operations of the federal government, military, the court system, those will all be carried out by the federal government, but other than that, everything else is statewide. If you look at what the federal constitution says, those are the only things that are actually prescribed to the federal government. I mean, they've overstepped their boundaries by a wide margin at this point, but at that time, that's all that is supposed to be prescribed in power to the federal government. And then everything else is handled on the state, and that in and of itself makes it much more federal than it does national, because if it was national, it's a top down all the time. You have the federal government coming down and making rules for all the states countrywide all the time on all aspects of society and life. So he describes that of a national government being one that power supersedes that over all persons and things, and that all domains are subject to their indefinite supremacy. The proposed constitution does not sustain that type of power. Individual states have their own sovereignty. So if it was a national government, their power themselves, they would supersede all persons, they would supersede all domains and all state governments, and they would have indefinite supremacy, and that's just not the case by what the federal constitution says. They only have a specific list of things that they are that is under their jurisdiction. So he explains that here. He states, and I quote, "But if the government be national with regard to the operation of its powers, it changes its aspects again when we contemplate in relation to the extent of their powers. The idea of a national government involves in it not only an authority over the individual citizens, but an indefinite supremacy over all persons and things so far as they are object of lawful government. Among a people consolidated into one nation, this supremacy is completely vested in the national legislature. Among communities united from the particular purposes, it is vested partly in the general and partly in the municipal legislatures. In the former case, all local authorities are subordinate to the supreme and may be controlled, directed, or abolished by it at their pleasure. In the latter, the local and municipal authorities, from distinct and independent proportions or portions of the supremacy, no more subject within their respective spheres to the general authority than the general authority is subject to them within its own sphere. So it's a little confusing, the way he explains it, but what he's really saying is, he's talking about two different scenarios. He's saying, one, you have the federal government really has all the authority, and they make every single rule straight down, top down structure. They tell them what roads they can drive on, what the taxation in each individual state's supposed to be, all of that, right? But that's actually not the case. The way it really works in our system, and this is why it's more of the federal nature rather than a national nature, is that you have the municipal authorities, and then you have your state governments, and they actually set the standard and they set the rules for a lot of that stuff. And then, like I said before, the state legislatures were supposed to be electing the senators too, so they kind of had their own power that went to the federal government. So our federal government, we've waned further away from the idea of a federal structure, and now it's much more of a national structure because of the vast scope that the federal government's been becoming and they've been getting. And that's why I like I said before, I'm a fan of the state legislatures electing the senators. So it's more representative of the sovereignty of the individual municipalities and the towns or the counties in the state. So if you have a state where everyone lives, and this is much more of a federal structure, it's much more federalistic. If you have a state where you have two big cities in the state and they comprise about 60% of the population in that state, and they vote heavy Democrat, so they vote Democrat no matter what, and because they have such a high population, they get senators elected because of it. Now, they already have their own power in the House of Representatives. They have an overbearing amount of power because of their population. They're already beating the crap out of all the Republicans that live in that individual state. So that's why I think, and the state legislature would represent each individual county. And if there's only those two big cities that have all the population of Democrats, generally the entire state legislature would really be much more of the Republican nature than of the Democrat nature, because those counties, there's only really a couple blue counties because those big cities, but other than that, everything else is red around them. And that's the point. It's supposed to be some sort of a balance between state legislatures and population, but that's not the case, because now you're getting a disenfranchisement of Republican voters that live in these rural or these suburban areas, because you have the cities overbearing them with the vote, where now my vote as a someone living in the suburbs is meaningless as a Republican. And that's essentially what the problem is with having a setup like, there's no problem with having the House of Representatives the way they are, but the senators should be the way they are, elected by the state legislatures. That's the way it should be, so it kind of equals out the two. So next, what do I have here? Next, Madison. I'm trying to think where I was. Madison explains, and I quote, "In this relation, then the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects." End quote. So he's saying, yeah, the federal government does have its power over specific things, and they have their jurisdiction, but all the other enumerated objects are to be the power of this and the sovereignty of individual states. So he states next, and I quote, "If we try the Constitution by its last relation to the authority by which amendments are to be made, we find it neither wholly national nor wholly federal. Were it wholly national, the supreme and ultimate authority would reside in the majority of the people of the Union, and this authority would be competent at all times, like that of the majority of every national society, to alter or abolish its established government. Were it wholly federal, on the other hand, the concurrence of each state in the Union would be essential to every alteration that would be binding on all, end quote. So if he's saying if it was federal, then you would need almost like a unanimity to change any type of government, and because the individual states would have to all agree if it was completely federal, and then if it was completely national, it would just be a majority vote of the people themselves, a democratic vote. But to amend the Constitution itself is a federal. It's a heavily much more federal act than it is a national act, because you have 2/3 of the House of Reps as well as the Senate. 2/3 of the two chambers of Congress are required to amend the Constitution, but 3/4 of state legislatures. So 3/4 is much of a higher scope than a 2/3. Thus, the is much more federal in nature because it's a higher percentage. So the mode, and he states next, the mode provided by the plan of the convention is not founded on either of these principles in requiring more than a majority in principles, in requiring more than a majority, and particularly in computing the proportion by states, not by citizens. It departs from the national and advances toward the federal character. In rendering the concurrence of less than the whole number of states sufficient, it loses again the federal and partakes in the national character. End quote. So this is another way to look at it. It says requiring more than a majority, and particularly in computing the proportion by states, not by citizens. It departs from the national. It's more federal, but then also rendering the fact that it's less than the whole number of states sufficient, it loses federal and now it becomes more national. So, and then next he goes on, he states, and I think this is the last quote. Wow, man, I did a pretty good job on this. He states, and I quote, "The proposed Constitution, therefore, is, in strictness, neither a national nor a federal Constitution, but a composition of both. In its foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it is partly federal and partly national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal nor wholly national." But I would like to argue that when it comes to amendments, it's much more federal than it is national. So yeah, it's a little confusing. That's why I highly suggest you check this one out, maybe read it. But that being said, Madison concludes that the proposed Constitution is both federal and national. In the foundation, it is federal. In its foundation itself, it is federal. In the sources of where its power is drawn from the people, it is partly federal and partly national, because the state legislature elects the senators, and the House of Reps is elected by a population vote, so that makes it national and federal. And its operations of its power, as in when it goes to war, or when it goes for treaties and things of that nature, because the scope of a war or a treaty is across the nation, that makes it of the power of a national. It's not when you go for a war, just certain states can say, well, we're not going to draft people, because then that would be more federal. It is more national, as in the scope of declaring war or the treaty. If there's a treaty, it relates to everyone. It's not on an on-state basis. So when there's a vote for, hey, you guys want to make a treaty, the state legislatures actually don't vote on that. It's supposed to be the senators and the House of Reps, and then it goes to the federal head, the executive. Actually, I don't even know if the House of Reps has a vote on it. It might just be the senators. But that makes it much more national. In the extent of the influence of those powers, it is federal. And in introduction of amendments, it is a combination of the both. Like I said, I think it's a little bit more federal than it is national, because you need 3/4 of a legislation of state legislatures, whereas you only need 2/3 of the two chambers of Congress. So that'll be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Yeah, this is a profound one here. It's very important, highly important. I suggest you show it to your friends, or you read Federalist number 39. It's very important. This is probably in the top 10 list of most important Federalist papers. So I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Everyone have a good weekend. Make sure you check out the weekend special, and I will see you next time.